Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you really need. When Margaret buried her husband in the cold Montana dirt, she thought she'd never feel hopeful again. Then Silas McGrow showed up at her cabin door like a big storm blowing in. This mountain man wasn't asking for a place to stay or food. He was making a bold claim that would surprise any proper lady. But out here, the wild has its own ways. To survive, you make choices city folks wouldn't get. Margaret has to decide if she'll face the wild alone or agree to a deal that scares her, but also feels kind of comforting to her sad heart. Can two hurt people find peace together? Or will the tough mountain winter take them both? Before we go on, tell us where you're listening from. And if you like this story, hit subscribe because I've got something super cool for you tomorrow. The wind smelled like snow in the Montana wilds, and Margaret Whitmore knew she had maybe 2 weeks before the deadly cold locked her in. She stood by her cabin window, her rough hands holding the wooden edge, watching the golden aspen leaves twirl their last dance. At 34, she felt so old, worn out by 3 years of tough frontier life that took her husband and almost broke her spirit. Henry's grave was right there outside her window, a plain wooden cross she carved with shaky hands just 6 weeks ago. The dirt had settled now, and she'd put river rocks around it in a pattern that reminded her of the garden they wanted to plant in spring. A spring Henry would never see. The cabin felt huge and tiny at the same time. Huge because Henry's absence was everywhere, where his laughter used to be. Tiny because the walls seemed to close in every night, reminding her she was all alone. There. Closest neighbors, the Hoffmans, lived 8 miles south through dangerous mountain paths. The town of Clearwater was 26 miles northeast, a full day's hard ride even in good weather. Margaret grew up in Philadelphia in a family that didn't have much money but had big expectations. Her dad, a clockmaker, taught her to read and do math, which was rare for a woman like her. Her mom taught her to sew, cook, and run a house like a boss. But neither prepared her for digging a grave in frozen ground so hard she had to light fires to soften it for her husband's fever-wrecked body. She met Henry Whitmore at a church event when she was 28. Older than most girls when they married, but her dad needed her help with the family business until her brother grew up. Henry was a dreamer, full of stories about Montana, where a man could claim land and build something forever. His eyes lit up when he talked about wide-open spaces, clean air, and living free from city smoke and noise. "We'll have sons, Margaret," he whispered on their wedding night. "Strong boys who'll carry our name into the next century. We'll build something important, something that lasts." 3 years later, Henry was dead under Montana dirt, and Margaret never got pregnant, even though they hoped and tried. The frontier gave them brutal winters, bad crops, and finally the fever that killed Henry in just 4 days. She nursed him through his confusion, held his hand as he talked about kids they'd never have, and made promises she couldn't keep about the life they planned. Now she faced the hard math of staying alive. Her food would last maybe 6 weeks, if she was careful. The little money Henry hid in a coffee tin might buy supplies in town, but only if she could make the risky trip. Their milk cow stopped giving milk, and she wasn't strong enough to keep their small chicken flock alive through winter. The worst wasn't the physical stuff, though that scared her plenty. The worst was the heavy loneliness that covered her, like a thick blanket she couldn't shake off. She talked to Henry's grave every morning, sharing her fears and plans like he might answer. She talked to the cabin walls just to hear a voice, even her own. She wrote letters to her family in Philadelphia, but their replies were polite brush-offs with a touch of worry. Her dad's health was bad. Her mom couldn't leave him. Her brother had his own young family. The message was clear. Margaret picked this life, so she had to figure it out herself. The afternoon Henry died, Mrs. Hoffman made the tough trip to sit with Margaret through her worst grief. Sarah Hoffman was a tough lady in her 50s who'd raised 4 kids in the wild and buried one. She spoke plainly about Margaret's situation. "You've got tough choices coming, dear," Sarah said while they washed Henry's body for burial. "This land doesn't forgive weakness, and it doesn't care about what's proper. You need to think, like the mountains do, about what survives, not what's comfy." Margaret nodded through her tears, not really getting it until the loneliness started eating at her like acid. Now she got it. The frontier didn't care about society's rules. Survival was the only thing that mattered. She'd heard whispers among the women when the men weren't around, stories of widows who made deals that would shock city folks. A woman near Fort Benton married her dead husband's brother a month after the funeral, not for love, but because he needed someone to cook and care for kids, and she needed someone to work the land and protect her. Another widow took in a drifter who stayed through winter and left in spring, but not before getting her pregnant with a kid she'd raise alone. The frontier asked for sacrifices city people couldn't understand. Margaret was lost in these. Heavy thoughts when she heard a sound that changed everything, the steady thump of an axe hitting wood. She knew every sound in her lonely world, and this wasn't right. No one should be chopping wood on her land. She grabbed Henry's rifle, made sure it was loaded, and went to the door. Through a gap in the logs she used as a window, she saw him. Even from far away, there was no mistaking the huge guy splitting wood by her cabin. He worked smoothly, like he'd done this 1,000,000 times. Each axe swing was perfect, each piece of wood falling exactly where he wanted. Silas McGrow. Even alone, Margaret had heard the stories. He was a legend among mountain men, a giant who lived alone in the high peaks, could track anything, and vanish into the wild like smoke. Some said he was a soldier once. Others said he was running from the law. Everyone agreed he was dangerous, in ways beyond his huge size and skills. He was maybe 40, with shoulders wide as a doorway and hands that could probably snap a neck easily. His dark hair hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered half his face. He wore worn-out buckskin, clothes, and even from a distance, she could see he moved easily, like a wolf totally at home in the wild. What stood out most was his calm. He wasn't rushing or looking around nervously. He was just chopping wood for a woman who needed it, like it was the most normal thing, like he belonged there. Margaret's heart pounded, but she felt something else under her fear, a weird relief. For the first time in 6 weeks, she wasn't totally alone. Someone else was doing something, solving her problem of winter firewood. When he finished chopping, Silas McGrow stood tall and looked right at her cabin. Even through the tiny window gap, Margaret felt his gaze. He raised a big hand, maybe saying hi or just noticing her, then walked toward her door with steady steps, like he knew exactly what he was doing next. Margaret put down the rifle and smoothed her skirt, though she didn't know why. Her hands shook as she lifted the wooden latch and leaned against the door frame to open it. Silas McGrow stood at her door like a mountain turned into a man. Up, close. His size was even scarier, but his eyes caught her attention. They were deep brown, almost black, and had a smart, patient look she didn't expect. When he spoke, his voice was surprisingly soft, a low rumble from deep in his chest. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, touching his hat in respect. "I knew your husband. He was a good guy who deserved better than what this land gave him." Margaret found her voice, though it was quieter than she wanted. "Mr. McGrow, thank you for the wood. I don't know how to pay you back." Something flashed in his dark eyes, not exactly a smile, but a knowing look that made her heart beat faster. "I think you do know, ma'am, and I think we both know why I'm here." The words felt like a challenge and a promise at the same time. Margaret felt like the world was tipping, like she was standing on a cliff with only 2 choices, fall or jump. "May I come in?" he asked. "We need to talk about some things that shouldn't be said outside." Margaret stepped aside, and Silas McGrow walked into her cabin, bringing the smell of pine smoke and leather and the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. Inside, Silas seemed to take up all the space. He took off his hat, showing hair more gray than black, and his eyes scanned the room like someone used to checking for danger or chances. Margaret watched him notice Henry's empty chair, the cold fireplace, the little food on her shelves. "You've got enough food for maybe a month," he said straight out. "Less if the cold hits early. Your roof needs fixing before snow, and that chicken coop won't survive the first big storm." Margaret felt her face get hot. "I'm doing okay." Silas looked at her with those dark eyes, and she saw maybe kindness mixed with hard truth. "No, ma'am, you're not. You're fading away, and we both know it." His words hit her like a punch because they were true. She sat in Henry's chair, grabbing the worn armrests. What do you want from me, Mr. McGraw? He went to her fireplace and started building a fire with the same smooth moves he used chopping wood. I want what any guy wants who's been alone too long. I want sons to carry my name. I want a woman to share the hard work of surviving here. And I want to know that when I die, something of me will stay in this world. Margaret watched the flames grow under his careful work. And why do you think I would? That I could? Because you're strong enough to have made it this far, Silas said, not looking at her. Because you loved your husband, but you're smart enough to know he's gone. And because winter's coming, like it or not, he stood and faced her, and Margaret felt his strong presence. This was a man who'd survived things she couldn't imagine. But when he spoke, his voice wasn't as harsh as she expected. I'm not offering marriage, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm not offering sweet words or love promises. I'm offering a chance to live through winter, and I'm asking for sons in return. Margaret's breath stopped. His offer was shocking but clear, and she found herself thinking about it like she used to balance her dad's accounts. And if I say no, then I'll leave you enough wood to last a month, and come spring, I'll help bury what's left of you. His blunt honesty should have upset her, but it felt oddly comforting. At least he wasn't lying or pretending things were different. A deal born from need. What exactly are you offering? She asked. Proud, her voice stayed steady. Silas looked out at Henry's grave through the window. I stay here through winter. I hunt, trap, fix things, keep you fed and warm. You cook, mend, and when the time comes, you carry my kids. In spring, we decide if we keep this going or go our separate ways. Margaret studied his face in the window's light. There was something strong in his shoulders, a dignity she didn't expect. And if I don't get pregnant, then we try again next winter, or the one after. I'm patient when it matters. She thought of Henry's dreams of sons, the kids they never had. The irony wasn't lost on her that this stranger was offering to make Henry's wish come true, just not how they'd planned. Why me? She asked. There are younger women in town, single ones who wouldn't need this kind of deal. Silas turned from the window and she saw a flash of something soft before his usual calm returned. Because you've already shown you can survive here. Because you know what it's like to love and lose someone. So you get what I'm offering. And because, he paused, picking his words, I saw you in town before Henry died. You had kindness in your eyes even when things were tough. That matters to me. Margaret felt a warmth in her chest, not from the fire he'd built. You've been watching me. I keep track of folks in my area, he said simply. It's how I stay alive. But yeah, I noticed you especially. Henry was a lucky guy. His plain compliment hit her harder than fancy words ever had. This man saw her clearly, her strengths, her weaknesses, her situation, and still found something worth wanting. Thunder rumbled far off, and they both looked toward it. Through the window, Margaret saw dark clouds piling up over the western peaks. A storm was coming soon, and she hadn't finished sealing the walls against winter drafts. I need time to think, she said finally. You've got until the storm hits, Silas replied. After that, the choice makes itself. As if he'd called it, the wind picked up, shaking the cabin's shutters and swirling leaves past the windows. Margaret felt the familiar fear of facing another mountain storm alone, lying awake, wondering if the roof would hold, if the walls would keep out the deadly cold. There's something you should know, she said quietly. Henry and I tried for 3 years to have kids. I might not be able to give you what you want. Silas nodded like he'd already thought of that. We'll deal with that if it happens. But I've seen how you care for your garden and animals. You've got a mother's heart, Mrs. Whitmore. Sometimes that's what counts most. The first big raindrops hit the windows, and Margaret made her choice. With the same careful thinking her dad taught her for tricky clockwork, she looked at the facts. She couldn't survive winter alone. Silas McGraw could keep her alive, and he was asking for something she'd wanted to give Henry. If I agree, she said, what happens to Henry's memory, to what we built here? Silas stepped closer, and she smelled pine and leather on him. Henry built this place for you to live in, not die in. The best way to honor him is to make sure his wife lives to see another spring. Outside, the storm was getting wild. Inside, Margaret looked into the eyes of a man who'd just offered her something she'd almost stopped believing in. Hope. "Okay," she said, her voice soft against the growing wind. "Okay, Mr. McGraw, I'll take your deal." Something eased in his face like a weight lifted. He reached into his coat and pulled out a knife unlike any she'd seen. The blade was perfect, the handle worn smooth from years of use, catching the firelight like lightning. "This was my dad's," he said, handing it to her handle first. "And his dad's before him. It's gotten me through more trouble than I can count. Keep it as a sign of our deal and my promise to keep you safe." Margaret took the knife, surprised by its weight and how it fit her hand. It felt important, like she was accepting more than a tool, part of his history and trust. "Thank you," she said simply. Outside, the storm hit with the full power of the mountains, wind screaming around the cabin. But inside, for the first time since Henry's death, Margaret felt truly warm. She wasn't alone anymore. Whatever came next, she'd face it with someone who understood the tough math of frontier life. Silas McGraw had become her partner in the biggest deal of all, trading companionship for a chance to see another day. The storm raged for 3 days, and during that time, Margaret learned more about Silas McGraw than she had about some folks she'd known for years. He moved through her cabin with surprising care for such a big man, never taking up too much space, always knowing where she was and what she needed. He fixed Henry's old rifle while the wind howled outside, his huge hands working carefully on the firing mechanism. Margaret watched him by firelight, seeing how he handled the gun like someone who'd relied on it to stay alive. When he was done, he handed it back to her with clear instructions. "The sight was off a bit," he said, guiding her hands to hold it right. "Henry probably didn't notice because he got used to it, but you need to know exactly where this shoots if you're going to count on it." Margaret felt his warm hands over hers and tried to focus on his words, not how close he was. "I've never been great with guns." "You will be," he said confidently. "This place doesn't let you stay helpless." On the second day, with the storm still raging, Silas started teaching her how to prepare animals for cooking. He'd brought rabbits from his traps, and Margaret watched closely as he worked, knowing these skills could mean life or death. "Most women know how to cook what their men bring home," he said, his knife moving like a surgeon's. "But out here, you need to know how to make something from nothing, how to use every part of an animal, how to make food last when hunting's bad." Margaret was surprised by how much she didn't know. She thought 3 years in the wild had taught her everything, but Henry had done a lot without her noticing. Silas was teaching her the difference between just getting by and really mastering the wild. "You're a good teacher," she said, practicing the knife cuts he showed her. "Had to be," he replied. "A man alone in the mountains either learns every trick or doesn't last long." That evening, as they sat by the fire listening to the wind rip at the cabin, Margaret got brave enough to ask the question on her mind. "Where did you come from, Mr. McGraw? I mean, before the mountains?" Silas was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice carried old pain he kept under control. "Pennsylvania. Had a wife there and a son. He'd be about 15 now if he'd lived." Margaret's heart hurt, understanding him. "What happened?" "Cholera took them both. Summer of 32. Buried them in the morning and was riding west by afternoon. Couldn't stay where everything reminded me of what I lost." She thought of Henry's grave outside and got the connection. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Long time ago," Silas said, but she could hear the pain still there. "Time didn't heal wounds like that. It just taught you to carry them without falling apart." "Is that why you want sons?" she asked softly. "To replace what you lost?" Silas looked at her, his face open and honest. "Can't replace what's gone. But a man needs to know his name will live on, that what he built keeps going. I've got skills, ways to survive here, that die with me unless I pass them on." Margaret nodded, understanding more than he might have thought. Henry felt the same. He wanted to build something lasting, something that mattered after we were gone. "Smart man," Silas said. "This land's tough enough without knowing everything you do dies with you." On the third day, the storm finally stopped, leaving the world covered in snow and ice. Silas went out to check his traps and see what The storm did while Margaret mended his shirt, a job that felt oddly personal, handling fabric that smelled of pine and carried his warmth. When he came back with fresh meat and news that the roof held strong, Margaret realized something had changed. They weren't strangers anymore. They felt almost like partners. "We'll need to get you better clothes before the next storm," Silas said as he cooked their lunch. "Warmer stuff, better boots." This was just a taste of what's coming. Margaret looked at her worn dress and thin shoes, seeing how unprepared she was for real winter. "I don't have money for new things." "Don't need money," he said. "I've got credit with traders. And besides," he paused, picking his words, "if you're carrying my child by spring, you'll need good gear to stay healthy through the cold." The mention of pregnancy made her stomach flutter, part fear, part excitement. She'd wanted kids with Henry, but this felt different, more practical, but also more urgent. With Silas, there was no slow romance or long engagement. If they were going to have a baby, it would happen soon. That night, as they got ready for bed in the cabin's one room, Margaret felt the weight of their deal like a heavy blanket. Silas had been sleeping on the floor by the fire, giving her the bed and as much privacy as the small space allowed, but she knew that couldn't last forever. "Mr. McGraw," she said quietly as he set up his bedroll, "about our deal. When should we—" He looked at her, and she was glad the dim light hit her red cheeks. "When you're ready, Mrs. Whitmore. Not before. Our deal doesn't change that you're a lady who deserves respect." Margaret felt grateful for his kindness, even as she knew the reality of their situation. Winter was getting worse, and every day brought them closer to needing all their strength together. "I appreciate that," she said. "It's just, this is so different from what I thought my life would be." "What we expect doesn't usually match what happens," Silas said. "But sometimes what happens turns out better. We won't know till we get there." As Margaret got into bed and listened to Silas quietly tending the fire and checking the door, she thought about the future in a way she hadn't since Henry died. For the first time in weeks, she could imagine seeing spring, picture herself alive when the snow melted and the world turned green. It wasn't the future she'd planned, but it was a future. And in a place where survival wasn't guaranteed, that felt like the best gift of all. 2 weeks into their deal, Margaret woke to find Silas gone from the cabin, his bedroll neatly put away and coffee warming on the stove. She'd gotten used to his quiet morning routine, how he moved without waking her, always leaving coffee and breakfast. She was putting on her warmest shawl when she heard voices outside, Silas's calm, deep voice and another man's nervous one. Margaret went to the window and felt her blood freeze. 3 men sat on horses by her woodpile, their faces rough and their clothes showing they lived outside the law. The leader, a skinny guy with a scar from his ear to his jaw, leaned forward in his saddle, eyeing Silas like a wolf sizing up prey. Margaret grabbed Henry's rifle, thankful now for Silas's lessons on how to use it. She couldn't hear their words, but she saw the tension in Silas's stance, his feet planted, hands loose, but ready. "We heard a widow was living out here, alone," the scarred man said as Margaret got closer to the door. "Thought we'd offer protection for the tough months." "Nice of you," Silas replied, sounding unbothered. "But the lady's got all the protection she needs." Margaret saw the 3 men glance at each other, clearly rethinking their plan. They'd expected to scare a helpless woman, not face a man who seemed so strong and dangerous. "Funny thing," the scarred man went on. "We asked in town about this place. Nobody said the widow had a man. Makes you wonder if you're just passing through." "Makes you wonder lots of things," Silas agreed. "Question is, if a guy's smart enough to wonder quietly and move on, or if he needs a lesson in minding his own business." The threat was so calm, Margaret almost missed it, but the riders got it right away. The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun, and Margaret held her breath. "Now, friend," the man said, "no need to get unfriendly. We're just looking out for folks alone out here. Lots of dangerous men in these mountains." "Yeah," Silas said softly. "There are." Something in his voice made the horses nervous. Margaret realized she was watching a master at staying calm, but ready for trouble. Silas didn't move or raise his voice, but everyone knew one wrong word could mean death. The scarred man seemed to figure that out. "Well then," he said, backing his horse up, "looks like everything's fine here. We'll move along." "Good choice," Silas said. "And gentlemen, Mrs. Whitmore's under my protection now. That means she's protected by everyone who likes my friendship and fears my anger. Spread the word." Margaret watched the men ride off, looking back, until they vanished into the trees. Only when they were gone did Silas turn to the cabin, and she saw a cold, ready look on his face that made her heart race. She opened the door before he knocked. "Are they gone?" "For now," Silas said, stepping inside and relaxing a bit. "But they'll tell others about you. Word spreads that a woman's out here, and we'll get more visitors." Margaret felt a chill not from the cold air. "What do we do?" "We make sure everyone knows you're not alone anymore," Silas said, looking out where the men disappeared. "And we make sure you're ready to defend yourself if I'm not here." That afternoon, Silas started teaching her seriously. He showed her how to load and shoot the rifle fast, how to judge distances and adjust for wind. More importantly, he taught her when to shoot and when to hide, how to spot trouble coming. "Most guys like that are cowards deep down," he said as they practiced behind the cabin. "They pick on the weak because it's easier than facing someone who fights back. But they're tricky when cornered, which makes them dangerous in another way." Margaret thought about what her family would think, seeing her in the snow, learning to shoot like a frontier fighter. It should have embarrassed her, but instead, she felt proud. She was becoming someone who could survive here, someone worthy of the name she took when she married Henry. "I never thought I'd learn stuff like this," she said, checking the rifle like he taught her. "Life doesn't go how we plan," Silas replied. "The question is, do we adapt or let it break us?" That evening, as they ate rabbit stew Margaret learned to make right, she studied this man who'd become so important to her life. The lamplight showed the silver in his hair and the lines around his eyes. He looked older than he was, but there was something timeless about him, like he'd always been this way. "Silas," she said, using his first name for the first time. "Those men today, would you really have killed them?" He looked at her over his coffee cup, no doubt in his answer. "If they'd threatened you, yes, without a second thought." His certainty should have scared her, but instead, she felt safe for the first time since Henry died. This man would protect her with his life, not out of love, but because she was his now, part of what he'd claimed to defend. "Thank you," she said simply. "Nothing to thank me for," he said. "A man protects what's his." Later, that night, as Margaret got ready for bed, she realized something had changed. The run-in with the riders showed what their deal really meant. She wasn't just a woman Silas was helping through winter. She was his responsibility, his to protect and provide for. And maybe, she thought, listening to him move quietly around the cabin, it was time to fully accept what that meant. The frontier demanded tough choices and practical steps. She'd agreed to have his kids, but she'd been holding back on the physical part of that promise. Looking at the man who'd just shown he'd kill to keep her safe, Margaret decided it was time to change that. Tomorrow night, she'd cross the final step from who she was to who she was becoming. Some promises, she realized, needed to be kept sooner rather than later. Margaret woke the next morning to find a small, tarnished locket by her coffee cup. She picked it up with shaky fingers, noticing its delicate design and how the silver caught the light despite its age. Inside was a faded picture of a young woman holding a baby, their faces faint but full of quiet happiness from better days. Silas was outside chopping kindling, and Margaret watched him through the window, holding the locket. His moves were steady, but she saw a softness in him today he rarely showed. When he came inside, shaking snow off his boots, he saw her holding the locket. "That was my wife, Ellen," he said quietly, "and our boy, Thomas. He was 6 months old in that picture." Margaret's throat tightened. "They were beautiful." "Ellen had the sweetest laugh," he said. "She could make flowers grow just by smiling at them." He went to the stove, but Margaret saw the tension in his shoulders. Thomas was just starting to stand when the sickness took them, had his mother's eyes. She closed the locket gently, feeling the trust he showed by sharing this. "Why show me this?" Silas turned, his face raw with honesty. Because last night made me see I've been asking you for something big without giving anything real back. You deserve to know who I am, where I'm from, what kind of man you're trusting with your life. Margaret set the locket on the table. Tell me. He poured coffee for them and sat across from her. I was a different guy then. Had a good job in Pittsburgh with a shipping company. Nice house, quiet street, plans for the future. Met Ellen at church. She was the preacher's daughter, pure as fresh snow and twice as beautiful. His voice held such love for his lost wife that Margaret felt a mix of sympathy and maybe a bit of jealousy, which she pushed aside as wrong. We were happy, Silas went on. Really happy, the kind you don't appreciate till it's gone. Planned for more kids, to build something lasting. Then cholera hit in 32, and in a week, I lost everything but their graves. Margaret touched his hand, feeling his warm, rough skin. I'm so sorry. Thought about ending it, he said plainly. Had the gun ready more than once. But something stopped me. Maybe Ellen's voice saying that's not what she'd want. Maybe just stubbornness. Packed what I could carry and headed west. Figured if I'd be alone, it might as well be somewhere that felt as empty as I did. Margaret understood completely. After Henry died, she'd wanted to hide from the world that took everything she loved. How did you become... She waved her hand, trying not to sound judgy about his mountain man reputation. Learned by need, Silas said. First winter almost killed me. Didn't know enough about the high country. Met an old trapper, Dutch Morrison, who felt sorry for me and taught me what I needed. By the time Dutch died, I'd found my place in these mountains. Do you regret leaving the city behind? Silas thought hard before answering. I miss things. Church bells on Sundays. Ellen humming while she cooked. Neighbors close enough to share troubles with. He looked at her. But I don't regret who I am now. The mountains don't lie or make empty promises. They're tough but honest. And that fits me. Margaret felt his words deep inside. The frontier had changed her too, peeling away polite. Manners and social rules until only raw truth was left. She wasn't just the clockmaker's daughter or Henry's proper wife anymore. She was Margaret, doing whatever it took to survive and maybe even thrive. The locket, she said. Why give it to me now? Because I want you to know I'm not just offering survival or kids. It's about building something new from what we've lost. Silas leaned forward, his eyes intense. I can't give you a fancy courtship or an easy life or take you away from this tough land. But I can promise you'll never face anything alone again. Margaret felt warmth in her chest, not from the fire. This wasn't the romantic love she had with Henry, but it was something maybe even better, a deep partnership of two people who knew loss and chose to face an unknown future together. I have something for you too, she said, getting Henry's family Bible from the shelf where it sat untouched since his funeral. She opened it to where she'd pressed flowers from her wedding bouquet. The colors were faded but still showed the sweet Williams and baby's breath she carried down the aisle. These are from the day I married Henry, she said, touching the brittle petals. I kept them to remember the happiest day of my life. But now they're about knowing happiness can come even after loss. She closed the Bible and met Silas's eyes. I want to be your wife, not just in name, but for real. I want to give you the sons you hope for, to build a partnership that can handle anything this land throws at us. Silas's face changed. Surprise, gratitude, and maybe the start of real affection. His voice was rough when he spoke. Margaret, he said, using her first name for the first time, I'll do everything I can to make sure you never regret. Saying that, outside, snow started falling again, but inside, warmth filled the cabin as two people who'd lost everything found the courage to hope for something new. Spring came early that year, and with it, news Margaret had hoped for and feared. She'd missed her monthly cycle twice, and the morning sickness left no doubt. She was carrying Silas's baby. She told him on a morning when he came back from checking traps with 3 big beavers, and news that the creek was running strong. He was in a great mood, talking about cabin repairs for next winter, when she found the courage to speak. Silas, she said, setting down her coffee, I need to tell you something. He looked at her, really looked, and she saw the moment he understood. A slow smile spread across his rugged face. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. "Pretty sure. About 2 months, I think." Silas crossed the cabin in 3 big steps, picked her up, and spun her around until she laughed despite her nerves. When he set her down, his hands stayed on her waist, his face full of wonder. "A baby," he said, like he was trying out the word. "Our baby." Margaret put her hands over his, feeling his familiar strength. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" Silas laughed, a joyful sound she'd never heard from him. "Margaret, you've given me something I thought I'd never have again. I'm more than happy, I'm thankful beyond words." That afternoon, Silas surprised her with a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. Inside was a wooden cradle, beautifully carved and polished, with pine branches and mountain flowers etched into the headboard. Margaret ran her fingers over the designs. "When did you make this?" "Been working on it for weeks," Silas admitted, looking shy. "Hoped I'd have a reason to give it to you someday." Margaret's eyes teared up. He'd been carving this for their baby before he even knew she was pregnant, working by lamplight after she was asleep, putting his hopes into every cut. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." As spring turned to summer, Margaret watched her body change with wonder and worry. She'd never been pregnant before, and despite Mrs. Hoffman's visits and reassurances, she feared doing something wrong. Silas, though, took to being a dad-to-be with the same calm skill he brought to everything. He learned what foods were good for pregnant women, studied birth from a medical book he got in town, and started preparing for their growing family with care. "We'll need to add a room to the cabin," he said one evening on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "Give the kids space to grow, and us some privacy when more come along." Margaret touched her growing belly, imagining the cabin full of kids' voices. "More kids?" "Well," Silas said with a grin, "I did say I wanted sons, plural, and you're pretty great at this baby-carrying business." Despite her happiness, Margaret struggled with unexpected feelings as her pregnancy went on. She felt guilty for finding joy with Silas when Henry never saw her pregnant. Their practical deal had grown into something deeper, not the fiery romance she had with Henry, but a steady partnership built on respect and growing care. "I dream about Henry sometimes," she told Silas one night in their shared bed. "He's holding our baby, the one we never had. When I wake up, I feel like I'm betraying both of you." Silas was quiet, his hand resting on her round belly. "Henry would want you to be happy," he said finally. "Any man worth loving would want that for his wife. And this baby," he paused, feeling a kick. "This baby's ours, Margaret, yours and mine. That doesn't take away from what you had with Henry." She looked at his face in the moonlight. "How'd you get so wise about this stuff?" "Lost enough to know what matters," he said simply. "Love isn't something you use up. The more you give, the more you have." As summer went on, word of Margaret's pregnancy spread through their scattered community of homesteaders and trappers. It was celebrated like a big deal, the way frontier folks cheered for new life in a place where surviving wasn't easy. Mrs. Hoffman got the women together to prepare for the birth, collecting supplies and sharing wisdom from generations of frontier moms. Even the men helped, with neighbors showing up to help Silas add to the cabin and strengthen the roof for winter. "Folks are happy for you," Sarah Hoffman told Margaret during a visit. "They were worried about you out here, alone, and Silas has a good name among people who count. They see this as proof that even this tough land can't stop life from finding a way." Margaret felt warmth that wasn't from the summer heat. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She was part of the community, tied to her neighbors by shared struggles and hopes. One evening in late August, as she and Silas sat on their bigger porch watching neighbors head home after helping with the cabin, Margaret realized how much her life had changed. The scared widow who'd nearly died alone was gone, replaced by a woman who felt at home in this harsh, beautiful land. "I love you," she said suddenly, the words clear and true. Silas looked at her, surprised, since they'd never talked about love before. Their relationship was built on need and respect, growing into care and partnership. But with his baby inside her and their future open like the Montana landscape, Margaret knew it was true. "I love you too," Silas said, his voice rough with feeling. "Didn't expect to. Didn't think I could after Ellen. But you've given me more than hope for sons, Margaret. You've given me faith that tomorrow can be better than today." He kissed her gently, like a promise bigger than their original deal. Margaret felt their baby kick, as if agreeing with this new vow of love that would shape their family. As night fell, she looked at Henry's grave in the moonlight beyond their garden. She felt no guilt now, only thanks for the love that brought her here and the new love that would carry her forward. "Thank you," she whispered to the wooden cross, not sure if she meant Henry or whatever force brought Silas to her door when she needed him most. Inside, as Silas checked the fire and locks, Margaret touched her belly and felt their son. She was sure it was a boy. Move strongly. "Soon, little one," she murmured. "Soon you'll be here, and we'll be a real family." Margaret was hanging laundry behind the cabin, enjoying the warm September sun, and how her baby calmed when she moved gently, when she heard horses coming. Silas was in town trading furs for winter supplies, so she felt nervous as she dried her hands and walked to the front. Two men in dark suits sat on horses that didn't look ready for mountain trails. One was old, with silver hair and a soft look, like he spent his life indoors. The other was younger, maybe 40, with sharp eyes and a sneaky expression, like someone who made money off others' troubles. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the older man asked, getting off his horse with effort. "Mrs. McGraw now," Margaret corrected, her hand on her round belly. The men glanced at each other, and Margaret felt uneasy despite the warm day. "Can we come in, ma'am? We need to talk about legal stuff with your late husband's estate." Margaret's mouth went dry. Henry never mentioned legal problems, but he often kept bad news from her. "What kind of legal stuff?" The younger man pulled a leather bag from his saddle. "I'm James Crawford, a lawyer from Denver. This is Mr. Elias Peaton from First, National Bank of Colorado. We're here about big debts your late husband owed before he died." "Debts?" Margaret felt the ground shift. Henry never said anything about debts. "Maybe we should talk inside," Crawford suggested, his tone kind but firm. Margaret led them into the cabin, glad Silas had made it bigger. The men seemed to fill the room with their serious purpose. Crawford opened his bag and pulled out official papers. "Mrs. McGraw," he said, checking his documents, "your late husband, Henry Whitmore, took a big loan from our bank in spring 1845 to improve this land and buy animals. The loan was tied to this property and everything on it." Margaret sank into her chair, one hand on her belly where the baby was moving, feeling her stress. "How much?" Peaton leaned forward, looking serious. "With interest and fees, the debt is now $847. The number hit Margaret like a slap. $800 was more money than she'd ever seen, more than most frontier families made in years. "That's impossible," she said weakly. "Henry would have told me about a debt like that. Men often hide money troubles from their wives," Crawford said with fake kindness. "But the law doesn't accept good intentions as payment. The bank's been patient because of Mr. Whitmore's death and your situation. But patience runs out." Margaret felt panic rising. "I don't have that kind of money. Nobody out here does." "Which is why we're here," Peaton said. "The bank can take this property to settle the debt. But since you're pregnant and winter's coming, we're willing to offer options." Crawford pulled out another paper. "You could give the land to the bank and stay as a tenant through winter for a small rent. Or," he paused, eyeing her, "we hear your new husband's well known in these mountains. Maybe he could take on the debt to keep the land." Margaret's mind raced. $800 was impossible for Silas, who lived by hunting and trapping. Even his best year wouldn't bring that much cash. "And if we can't pay?" she asked, dreading the answer. "Then the land will be sold at auction in 30 days, Peaton said flatly. "Any money left after the debt would go to you." Margaret almost laughed at the cruel joke. Who'd buy a remote homestead in these mountains? They'd be lucky to get $100 for land and a cabin that held years of Henry's hard work. "I need to talk to my husband," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Of course," Crawford agreed, standing. "We'll be in Clearwater a few days." "But Mrs. McGraw, time's short." The bank's patience is almost gone, and legal processes are hard to stop once they start. After they left, Margaret sat in the cabin, which suddenly felt like it didn't belong to her. She thought of Silas's careful improvements, the room for their baby, the hours he spent making their home safe. How could she tell him it wasn't really theirs? When Silas came back at sunset, his wagon full of supplies and his face happy from good trading, Margaret's heart broke more. He'd used his own reputation to prepare for their family's future. Now she had to ruin it with news of Henry's secret debts. "You look like you saw a ghost," Silas said, crossing to her. "Are you okay? Is it the baby?" "Sit down," Margaret said quietly. "We need to talk." She told him everything, watching his face get serious. When she finished, Silas stared into the fire he'd built against the evening chill. $800, he said finally. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know Henry borrowed money." "It's not your fault," Silas said gently. "Henry was trying to build something for you and your family. Can't blame a guy for that." Margaret's eyes burned with tears. "But what do we do? How can we possibly—" Silas stood and looked out at the land they loved. "I've got some money saved," he said slowly. "Maybe $200 in gold and silver hidden where I used to winter alone. My furs might bring another $100 this season." "That's not even half," Margaret said. "No," Silas agreed. He looked out the window, his shoulders set. "There's another way," he said quietly. "Something I swore I'd never do again." "What are you talking about?" Silas went to their bedroom and came back with a small wooden box Margaret had never seen. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a military medal and a document with official seals. "I wasn't just any soldier before the mountains," he said, his voice steady. "I was an Army scout, tracking hostile Indians and recovering stolen goods. The government owes me money, back pay, and bounties. I never collected because I wanted to disappear." Margaret stared at the medal, knowing it was important even if she couldn't read the military words. "How much money?" "Enough," Silas said. "More than enough to pay Henry's debt and keep this land. But collecting it means going back to a life I left for good reasons." Margaret felt their baby kick, sensing the tension. She looked at this man who'd become her everything, protector, provider, partner, father of her child, and saw he was ready to give up his peace for her. "What reasons?" she asked quietly. Silas met her eyes, showing old pain. "The kind that wake you screaming at night. The kind that teach a man some prices are too high no matter what you gain." Outside, night fell over the mountains, bringing the weight of choices that would shape not just their future, but who they'd become. The next morning brought the first hard frost, and with it, a clear decision that cut through Margaret's fears. She'd lain awake beside Silas, hearing his steady breathing, knowing he wasn't sleeping either. "I want to see it," she said, as he built the morning fire. He looked puzzled, and she pointed to the box on the table. "The medal, the papers. I want to understand what you're giving up for us." Silas paused, then opened the box carefully, like it was precious and dangerous. The medal was silver, worn smooth with an eagle and words she couldn't read in the dim light. "Congressional Medal of Honor," Silas said quietly, "for what I did in the Seminole campaign in Florida. I was 26 and dumb enough to think courage and a good cause could fix anything." Margaret lifted the medal, surprised by its weight. "What did you do?" "Led a rescue to save settlers taken in a raid. 37 people, mostly women and kids, held in a Seminole stronghold in the Everglades." His voice was flat, like it wasn't his story. "Took 12 men in, brought 49 out, lost 3 of my soldiers. That sounds like something to be proud of." "Does it?" Silas looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "Tell that to the wives of the men who died. Tell that to the Seminole families we killed to get those settlers back. War makes heroes out of men who do awful things for necessary reasons." Margaret set the medal down, starting to see why Silas buried this past so deep. "The government owes you money for this? Not for the medal, for what came after." Silas unfolded the papers, his hands steady despite his emotion. "They wanted more missions, more rescues, more of what made that first one work. Kept sending me into dangerous lands expecting miracles." He pointed to numbers on the paper. "Back pay, hazard pay, bounties for recovered goods, and captured enemies." Adds up to about $200. Enough to clear Henry's debt and have some left. Margaret felt hope mixed with dread. Then why not collect it? Because it means going back to Fort Leavenworth, facing military rules, answering why I vanished without leave 10 years ago. Silas folded the papers neatly. It means being Sergeant Monroe again. Not just Silas, the mountain man who wants to be left alone. Would they arrest you for leaving? Maybe. Depends on how much they need my skills. There's trouble brewing with the Plains tribes, and the Army's short on good scouts. They might forgive desertion for service. Margaret's heart raced as their baby moved restlessly. The idea of Silas leaving, especially with the baby coming, made her panic. But losing their home, being homeless with a newborn in winter, was worse. There's got to be another way, she said desperately. What about the bank? Can we negotiate? Pay over time? Silas shook his head. Men like Peton don't come this far for partial payments. They want it all or the land. That's how banks work. They don't wait for poor folks. Margaret spent the morning thinking of every option. She wrote to her family back east, knowing they had no money to send. She added up everything they owned, Henry's tools, their animals, and it wasn't enough. That afternoon, Mrs. Hoffman showed up, her face worried. Heard about your visitors yesterday, Sarah said, taking Margaret's coffee offer. Word. Spreads fast out here. People are concerned. Margaret blushed. I guess everyone knows about Henry's debts now. Don't worry about what folks think. We've all made money mistakes trying to build something here. Sarah leaned forward, serious. What are you going to do? Margaret spilled the whole story. Silas's army past, the money owed, the awful choice between his freedom and their home. Sarah listened quietly, nodding sometimes. That man of yours, Sarah said when Margaret finished, he's willing to go back to soldiering for you. He says he is. But Sarah, you should see his face when he talks about it. Whatever happened in the army changed him in ways that still hurt. Sarah sipped her coffee, staring into the fire. My husband fought in the Mexican War, she said finally. Came back different, quieter, like he was always listening for something we couldn't hear. Some men pay a bigger price for their service. Then you get why I can't ask Silas to do this. I get why you don't want to, child. But sometimes the hardest choices are the ones we let others make for themselves. Sarah patted Margaret's hand. Silas isn't the type to offer something he's not ready to do. That evening, Margaret watched Silas prepare with his usual careful efficiency. He cleaned his best rifle, sorted clothes to look military, and wrote letters to contacts he'd kept despite wanting to vanish. You don't have to do this, Margaret said as he wrapped his medal and papers in fresh cloth. We could leave, start over somewhere else. Go where? Silas asked gently. You're 7 months pregnant, Margaret. Winter's coming and we can't afford new land. This is our home. Our kid deserves to be born in his own house, on his own land. Tears welled up, her hormones and fear mixing. I'm scared, Silas. Scared of you leaving, of what might happen, of being alone again. Silas pulled her into his arms, careful of her belly. I'm scared too, he admitted. But I'm more scared of failing you, of not being the man you deserve, the dad our kid needs. You're already both those things. Then trust me to keep being them, even if it means doing something I'd rather not. He kissed her forehead. I'll be back, Margaret. Whatever it takes, however long, I'll come home to you and our son. Outside, winter wind shook the cabin, reminding them time was short. In 3 weeks, the bank would take their home, unless they found nearly $900. In 6 weeks, their baby would arrive, and somewhere in between, Silas would have to become the soldier he'd left behind. Margaret touched her belly, feeling their child's strong kicks, and made her own silent promise. Whatever happened, whatever it cost, she'd make sure their son knew his father's courage, not just the battlefield kind that earned medals, but the quiet bravery of facing old pain to protect the family he loved. The next morning, Silas would ride east to Fort Leavenworth to face his past. Margaret would stay in their cabin, guarding their future and preparing for the birth that would make them a family, if Silas could win back their home. 2 weeks after Silas left, Margaret was looking through Henry's old trunk for extra blankets when she found something odd, a leather folder hidden under a secret bottom. Her heart raced as she pulled it out, realizing Henry had built this hiding spot without telling her. Inside, wrapped in oiled paper, was a document that made her hands shake. The original land patent signed by the territorial governor, proving Henry owned their property outright. Even more shocking was a second paper, a receipt from First National Bank, dated 3 months before Henry's death. Margaret read it twice to believe it. Payment in full, $847, outstanding balance, 0. Henry had paid the whole debt, but somehow the bank's men didn't know or were lying. She sat in Henry's chair, holding the papers to her chest, as the truth hit her. There was no debt. There never was, at least not when Henry died. The bank was either wrong or trying to cheat her. But Silas was already on his way to Fort Leavenworth, ready to give up his peace for a debt that wasn't real. She had no way to reach him, no way to stop him from making that awful deal to return to the army. She was still sitting there, staring at the receipt, when she heard horses. Through the window, she saw Crawford and Peyton coming, their faces smug, like men ready to collect. Margaret met them at the door, papers in hand like weapons. "Gentlemen," she said, surprised by her steady voice, "I was hoping you'd come back. I've got something to show you." Crawford got off his horse clumsily. "Mrs. McGrow, I hope you've thought about our kind offer. Time's running out, and the bank's patience is almost gone." Margaret held up the receipt. "This shows my husband paid his debt in full 3 months before he died. Either your records are wrong or you're trying to trick me." The men froze. Peyton's face turned red, while Crawford's went blank, like a lawyer caught lying. "That's impossible," Peyton sputtered. "Our records show—" "Your records are wrong," Margaret said firmly. "This is an official receipt with your bank's seal and signature, unless you're saying your bank gives out fake documents." Crawford stepped forward. "Can I see that receipt, Mrs. McGrow?" She was ready for that. "Sure, but I'm keeping the original. You can look, but don't touch." She held it up, watching Crawford's face as he read it. She saw the moment he knew it was real. His confident look slipped, turning to worry or scheming. "It looks real," he admitted slowly, "but there might be confusion about the timing." "No confusion," Margaret said. "The date's clear, the amount's exact, and the signature matches other bank papers Henry kept. He paid in full, so this land is mine, free and clear." Peyton tried to push back. "Even if it's real, there are other things. Interest, penalties, fees, which would be listed on the receipt if they mattered." Margaret cut in. "It says payment. In full, balance 0. No wiggle room." She saw the men glance at each other, talking without words. These were guys used to scaring widows and homesteaders who didn't know better. They didn't expect a woman who could read legal papers and stand her ground. "Mrs. McGrow," Crawford said carefully, "even if there's an error with your husband's account, the bank has claims on this land." "The bank has no claims," Margaret said flatly. "And if you keep saying it does, I'll take this to the territorial authorities. They'll want to know about a Denver bank trying to take land that's fully paid for." Her threat hit hard. Both men knew frontier justice didn't like banks preying on settlers, especially pregnant women making honest lives in tough land. "Maybe we should go back to Denver and check our records," Crawford said after a pause. "There might have been a mistake." "I think that's smart," Margaret agreed. "And I'll write to the territorial governor to make sure there are no more mistakes about my land." As the men rode off, Margaret felt fierce pride. She'd faced down men, trying to steal her home, and she'd done it alone without Silas or anyone else. Now she just hoped Silas would come back safe, and their child would be born into a secure future. Margaret went into labor on a Tuesday morning in early November, 3 weeks after facing the bank men, with no word from Silas. Mrs. Hoffman had moved into the cabin the week before, sensing the baby was close and refusing to leave Margaret alone. "Babies come when they're ready, not when it suits us," Sarah said, as Margaret gripped the bedpost through a contraction. "This little one's eager to see the world." Margaret had pictured this moment so many times, always with Silas holding her hand, cheering her on, sharing the joy and fear. Instead, she faced it not knowing if Silas was alive, dead, free, or locked up, coming home or gone forever. "I need him here," she gasped between pains. I need Silas. I know, dear, Sarah soothed, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead. But your baby needs you to be strong now. You've got everything you need for this. Women have been having babies without men around forever, through wars and wanderings. Labor went on all day, steady and normal, Sarah said. Margaret thought of her mom, who'd birthed 6 kids in their Philadelphia home. She thought of Ellen McGrow, Silas's first wife, who died giving birth to their son. She thought of all the frontier women who faced this with only their strength and other women's help. As evening came and the pains got stronger, Margaret heard something that made her heart jump, a horse galloping close. Sarah heard it too and checked the window. "It's a rider, coming fast, could be—" Margaret cried out as another pain hit, and Sarah rushed back. "Don't worry about outside, you've got work to do here." But Margaret heard voices, Silas's deep tone and another man's higher one. Relief hit her so hard she laughed through her pain. "He's home," she said, tears falling. "Sarah, he's home." The door opened, and Silas filled the doorway, still in travel clothes, looking like he'd ridden hard for days. His eyes found Margaret right away, full of relief, love, and fierce protection. "How is she?" he asked Sarah, moving to Margaret's side, trying not to panic. "She's doing what she needs to," Sarah said firmly. "And this baby's ready to come any minute. You got here just in time." Silas took Margaret's hand, and she felt his familiar strength and warmth. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough with tiredness and emotion. "I tried to get back sooner." "You're here now," Margaret said, gripping his hand as another pain started. "That's what matters. The bank, the debt." "I got the money," Silas said. "But later," Sarah ordered, like she'd done dozens of births. "Your wife needs to focus on bringing your son into the world." The final part of labor came fast. Margaret's body took over, driven by instincts older than anything. With Silas holding her hand and Sarah guiding her, she pushed their child into the world. As the sun set over the mountains, the baby's first cry filled the cabin, strong, mad, and perfect. Sarah worked fast, cleaning and checking the baby while Margaret and Silas watched in awe. "It's a boy," Sarah said happily, wrapping him in blankets Margaret had made. Strong and healthy, with his dad's lungs and his mom's grit. She placed the baby in Margaret's arms, and Margaret's heart grew in ways she didn't know it could. Their son was perfect, tiny but lively, with dark hair and eyes that seemed wise. "He's beautiful," Silas whispered, touching a tiny hand. "Margaret, he's perfect." Their son grabbed Silas's finger with surprising strength, like he knew this was his dad, his protector, the one who'd teach him to survive this tough world. "What'll you name him?" Sarah asked, cleaning up with satisfaction. Margaret looked at Silas, seeing tiredness, joy, and overwhelming love in his face. "Henry Silas McGrow," she said without hesitating, "to honor the man who brought me here and the man who made this moment possible." Silas's eyes filled with tears he didn't hide. "Henry Silas McGrow," he repeated softly. "Welcome home, son." Outside, winter wind picked up, but inside, their new family was complete. Spring came back to Montana with unusual warmth, and Margaret sat on their bigger porch, watching 6-month-old Henry Silas McGrow play with his hands. Their son lay on a soft blanket she'd sewn during winter, gurgling happily in the morning sun while his parents sipped coffee and felt the quiet joy of surviving another tough season. "He'll be walking soon," Silas said, watching their son kick his legs hard. "Look at those muscles." Margaret smiled, remembering her pregnancy fears about loving a child born from such a practical deal. Those worries seemed silly now, watching Henry grab Silas's finger with the same strong grip he had at birth. Love, she'd learned, didn't need perfect starts or romance. It just needed 2 people open to caring completely. "Tell me again about Fort Leavenworth," she said, leaning against Silas's shoulder. "You never finished the story." Silas watched their son with wonder that still seemed to surprise him. Not much of a story. Rode up expecting a court-martial, and found the army so desperate for scouts they'd overlook anything. Colonel Morrison remembered me from the Seminole campaigns, said I was the best tracker he'd worked with. And they just gave you the money? Eventually. Had to fill out forms, do interviews, prove I was me. Military paperwork moves. Slower than frozen molasses. Silas chuckled. Spent 3 weeks in officer quarters answering the same questions while clerks tried to figure out how to handle a ghost who showed up again. Margaret thought about those 3 weeks. The fear she felt caring for their newborn, wondering if Silas would come back. You never thought about staying, taking their offer? For about 5 minutes, Silas admitted. The pay was good, and they offered me my pick of jobs. But then I thought of you and Henry waiting here, the life we're building, and knew I'd already found what I wanted. Their son cried out, and Margaret picked him up, settling him against her shoulder where he quieted. At 6 months, Henry was showing his dad's calm nature and his mom's sharp mind, studying the world with serious dark eyes. Mrs. Hoffman thinks he'll talk early, Margaret said, feeling his solid weight. Says he watches people's mouths too closely when they talk. Smart boy, Silas said proudly. Takes after his mom. Horses approaching broke their quiet morning, and Margaret felt a quick alertness, still nervous about strangers. But it was neighbors, the Hoffmans, the Carlsons, and other families from their community. Looks like company, Silas said, standing to greet them. What followed was one of those unplanned gatherings that made frontier life bearable. Sarah Hoffman brought fresh bread and town news. Tom Carlson asked about summer hunting spots. Kids played while adults shared coffee. And talk on the porch Silas built for such days. You two are quite the story, Sarah told Margaret as they watched the men talk about the harvest. Word spread about how you stood up to those bank men and how Silas sorted his army money. Folks say it shows this land doesn't have to break you if you're strong and smart enough to fight back. Margaret looked at her neighbors, her husband holding their son while talking with other dads, the cabin that had grown from a desperate shelter into a real home. I never thought I'd find such happiness here, she said quietly. When Henry died, I thought my life was done. I never imagined I'd have a family and a place in a community like this. Life surprises us, Sarah agreed. The trick is seeing happiness when it shows up in work clothes instead of fancy ones. As evening came and their neighbors left, Margaret thought about her journey to this moment. The scared widow, who'd nearly died of loneliness. The desperate deal that seemed like her only hope. The slow shift from necessity to partnership, and finally love. Henry's grave was still visible from the porch, the wooden cross weathered, but standing, a reminder of the love that brought her here. But it didn't feel like guilt anymore. It was part of their life's landscape, proof that love could take many forms, and one dream's end could be another's start. As Silas put their son in the carved cradle for his evening sleep, Margaret saw her story come full circle. She'd started as a woman who'd lost everything, with only impossible choices. Now she was a woman who'd built something lasting, with a man who knew survival and love were partners in the dance of making a life worth living. Their son's first blanket, sewn during long winter nights, covered him as he slept, safe with parents who'd learned the strongest foundations, came from shared challenges faced together. Outside, night fell over the Montana mountains, promising another day. Inside, 3 people who'd become a family slept soundly, knowing they'd face tomorrow together. Sometimes, Margaret thought before sleep took her, the best stories start with endings and find new beginnings through the courage of people hoping for something better than what they lost.